You know that feeling when you finally move into your dream home? That's exactly what happened to us. After months of searching, we found a spacious house with a big yard in a quiet neighborhood. Everything seemed perfect until we met Steve. In the first few days, while my wife and I were still settling in, he showed up. He knocked on the door with a forced smile and eyes that wouldn't stop blinking. It seemed like he wanted to be friendly, but there was something about him that didn't sit right with me. It was like he was acting, trying too hard to be likable. My wife, always the more sociable one, invited him in. He declined and said he just wanted to welcome us. Steve was kind of odd. Short, messy hair, a nervous way of constantly fidgeting with his hands, and that gaze. Whenever he talked to us, his eyes seemed to never focus on anything specific, like he was always watching something beyond us. At the time, I didn't think much of it. He was just the neighbor next door, right? Maybe a little weird, but harmless. After he left, I shrugged it off and got back to unpacking. My wife mentioned that Steve seemed nice, but inside, I wasn't so sure. I didn't say anything. Maybe it was just my imagination. After all, I was tired and stressed from the move. There was no real reason to worry. In the days that followed, things started to calm down. The kids loved the new yard, running around everywhere, and I began to relax. But then, I started noticing some strange things. One evening, while I was in the yard, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. In the window of the house next door, there he was, Steve, standing there watching. He was on the second floor, just staring. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to figure out what he was doing. But as soon as he realized I had seen him, he quickly stepped away from the window. At that moment, my stomach churned. I didn't know why he was watching, but something told me it wasn't normal. I tried not to think too much about it because, maybe he was just distracted. But deep down, I already knew this was going to be a problem. And then it got worse. After that first incident, I started to realize it wasn't just a coincidence. Steve was always watching, almost like he was waiting for something. What made me even more uneasy was when I noticed that he wasn't just looking at me or my wife. He was watching the kids. I had just gotten home from work, tired and just wanting to relax. The kids were playing in the yard, laughing and running around. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and suddenly, something made me glance out the window. It was automatic, I can't even explain it. And there he was again, Steve, standing there, staring at the kids. But this time, he didn't back away when he saw me. No, he stood there firm as if challenging me. My eyes locked with his, and for a second, I froze. There was something very wrong with that look. It was different from just a curious neighbor. It was disturbing. I discreetly called my wife over, trying not to alarm the kids. She came, looked out the window, and before she could say anything, I already knew what she was going to say. "Do you see this?" I asked, and she said, "Maybe he's just lonely, I don't know." Lonely? Maybe. But this didn't feel like loneliness. Felt like something darker. I tried to ignore it, I swear. I tried to go on with life as usual, but you know how it is, this kept eating at me. I started noticing it more often, like Steve had some kind of pattern. He always appeared when the kids were outside, like he knew exactly when to watch. And me? I was getting more and more paranoid. I even thought about putting up thicker curtains or fencing in the yard. Anything to stop him from seeing what we were doing. But none of it worked. Even when I didn't see him, I felt like I was being watched. It was a constant feeling, a presence that wouldn't go away. One day, while we were having dinner, I tried to bring it up with my wife again. I told her that something wasn't right, that Steve wasn't just a weird neighbor, that he was paying attention to our kids in a sick way. But she, trying to be rational, insisted that I was overreacting, that I needed to relax. And for a moment, I even tried to convince myself of that. But deep down, I knew Steve wasn't going to stop. I wasn't overreacting. This was just the beginning. It got to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. Steve was everywhere, or at least that's how it felt. Every time I left the house, there he was, either in the yard, at the window, or even on the sidewalk, as if he was waiting for something. And me? I couldn't shake the feeling that he was always keeping an eye on the kids. One Saturday afternoon, I decided that enough was enough. We were in the backyard, enjoying the day, when I noticed Steve at his window again. This time, he wasn't even trying to hide it. He was there, in plain view, staring directly at the kids as they played on the grass. That was the last straw. My wife was inside the house preparing lunch. I didn't care about being rational or trying to keep the peace anymore. I was going to deal with this once and for all. I took a deep breath, tried to stay calm, and walked over to his house. I knocked hard on the door. My heart was racing, a mix of anger and fear nearly making me lose my composure right there. Steve took a while to answer, and when he finally opened the door, that same odd smile was on his face. "Can I help you?" he asked, as if he had no idea why I was there, as if he were just an ordinary neighbor expecting a friendly chat. I didn't waste time. "Look, Steve, we need to talk. I've noticed you watching my kids. I don't know what you're thinking, but this needs to stop. Understood?" He stayed silent for a moment, still with that forced smile, but his eyes, those eyes were cold. "Watching? Me? You must be mistaken, friend. I'm not doing anything like that. I think you're imagining things." I wasn't imagining it. There was no way. "Don't give me that. I've seen you at the window several times. This has to stop, and I mean it." That's when the smile disappeared. Steve took a step forward, getting too close. The change in his expression was fast and frightening. The calm look turned into something menacing. "What exactly are you accusing me of? Are you threatening me? I'm a law-abiding citizen, you know? I could very well call the police and say that you're harassing me." That word, harassing, made my blood run cold. How did he manage to flip the situation like that? He was trying to make it look like I was the one in the wrong. Harassing? I'm just trying to protect my kids. That's all. "Your kids?" he said with a sinister tone. "Careful what you say. Children are vulnerable. The world is a dangerous place, you know? Things can easily get out of control." My blood boiled, but before I could say anything else, he took a step back and, with the same calmness as before, shut the door in my face. I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. He had just threatened me, I was sure of it, but he did it in such a subtle way that if I told anyone, it would sound like I was crazy. I went back home, more tense than ever. My wife could tell something was wrong, but I didn't go into details. I just told her that Steve was a bigger problem than I thought and that we needed to be careful. She looked at me with concern, but she was still trying to be the voice of reason. "Let's wait it out, maybe this will pass. He can't do anything to us." But I knew Steve wouldn't stop. Whatever was happening, it was just beginning, and somehow I felt my family was in danger. The nights started getting longer. After that confrontation with Steve, I couldn't sleep properly anymore. Every little noise would make me jump out of bed, sweating. It felt like every time I closed my eyes, something was there, in the darkness, watching me. But it wasn't just paranoia. Strange things started happening. It was one of those nights after midnight. The house was quiet. Everyone was asleep. I was just about to drift off when I heard the first sound. Something light, but distinct, like footsteps downstairs. I stayed quiet, trying to listen more closely. More footsteps, slow, as if someone was walking around the living room. I got out of bed carefully, trying not to wake my wife, and went to the bedroom door. I looked down the hallway. Everything was dark. I took a deep breath and crept down the stairs, feeling each step creak beneath my feet. When I reached the living room, nothing. Everything was normal. No sign that anyone had entered. But I knew I had heard something. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting. And then, around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, coming from the direction of the window. I got up again, this time with my heart pounding in my chest. I went to the bedroom window and pulled the curtain aside. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty yard and the darkness outside. But then my eyes adjusted, and I saw a shadow moving. It looked like someone standing near the fence. I held my breath, trying to get a better look. The figure was there, facing away from me, and seemed to be staring directly at Steve's house. I couldn't tell if it was really him, but the feeling that something was wrong was overwhelming. I decided I had to do something. I grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs again. I opened the back door and stepped into the yard, shining the light around. "Who's there?" My voice came out shakier than I expected. I took a few steps forward, but the shadow was gone. Nothing. The yard was empty. The silence was so heavy it felt like it was suffocating me. I went back inside, locked the door, and secured everything. I stood in the kitchen, breathing deeply, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. I knew someone had been out there. Steve? Maybe. Someone else? I didn't know. In the days that followed, the noises continued. Footsteps on the roof, whispers near the windows, even a faint crying sound that seemed to come from far away, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly where. I tried to talk to my wife about it, but she thought I was becoming obsessed. "You need to relax," she'd say. "You're letting this consume you." Maybe she was right, but the problem was that the more time passed, the more I felt like I wasn't safe in my own home. Steve knew what he was doing. He was toying with me, and the worst part? I had no way to prove anything. The police wouldn't do anything without evidence, and Steve was careful. It was like he knew exactly how to push me to the brink of insanity without crossing the line. So night after night, I kept watch. Because one thing was certain. Steve was waiting for the right moment to act, and I had to be ready. Things started getting more sinister. It wasn't just the noises or the shadows in the yard anymore. Now, there was something more personal, something that seemed tailored to mess with my head. It started with the messages. It was an ordinary morning. I woke up exhausted, with that feeling that the night hadn't been long enough. I went to the door to get the newspaper and saw an envelope on the ground, right next to the mailbox. There was no stamp, no return address. Just my name written by hand on a crumpled, dirty piece of paper. I opened the envelope right there on the porch. Inside, there was only a folded piece of paper with a single sentence written on it. "You know what he wants." My stomach twisted into knots. I looked around, trying to see if anyone was watching, but the street was empty. I went back inside, trying not to make a fuss. I showed the note to my wife, and as I expected, she thought it was just a bad prank. Someone probably passed by during the night and thought it'd be funny to scare you, but I knew it wasn't that. Steve was playing with my mind, and now he wanted me to know that he was in control. In the following days, more notes appeared. Always left at the same time, always in the morning, always with short, cryptic phrases. "They're watching. The end is near. You'll never escape." Each new message made me more paranoid. Who else knew about this? Was it just Steve, or were other people involved? I started doubting everything and everyone. I reached the point where I installed cameras around the house. I needed to catch Steve in the act, prove that he was the one terrorizing me. But somehow, he always managed to slip by. The notes kept showing up, but the cameras never caught anything. It was like he knew exactly where they were and how to avoid being seen. My wife started getting genuinely worried about me. She said I was obsessed, that I couldn't stop talking about Steve and the notes. "You're getting paranoid," she'd say. "You need to get out of the house, breathe some fresh air, and stop thinking about this." But how could I stop? Steve wasn't going to stop. And the more I tried to protect my family, the more isolated I felt. The worst part was that, despite all the tension, I still didn't know what exactly he wanted. Was his goal just to drive me insane, or was there something more? Then came the most disturbing note of all. It was there on the porch like the others, but this time with a photo inside. When I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. It was a photo of my kids, taken in our backyard, probably while they were playing. But in the background, far off, you could see Steve standing near the fence, smiling. That strange smile he always had on his face. I broke down. I showed the photo to my wife, and this time she went pale. My God, how did this happen? Was he in our backyard? She finally understood. Steve wasn't just playing games. He was close, too close. And now I knew I didn't have time to wait for things to fix themselves. I had to act before it was too late. After that photo, everything changed. My wife, who had been trying to be the voice of reason, was now as terrified as I was. We could no longer ignore what was happening. Steve had crossed a line, and the worst part was that he knew we were vulnerable now. The atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Every noise, every shadow outside felt like it was him. We were on the verge of collapse. We decided it was time to call the police. I was done waiting, done trying to handle this on my own. I showed the notes and the photo to the officer who came to our house. He looked at everything with that expression of a professional used to dealing with strange cases, but I could see in his eyes that he wasn't taking it seriously. "This could just be a prank," he said. "Are you sure you don't know anyone who would do this to mess with you?" I took a deep breath, trying not to lose my cool. "This isn't a prank. It's my neighbor, Steve. He's been watching my kids, leaving these notes, and now this photo. He's been in our backyard." The officer jotted something down in his notepad but maintained that indifferent posture. "Okay, we'll have a talk with him, see if we can get any information. But without solid proof, it'll be hard to do anything more than issue a warning." They went over to Steve's house that afternoon. I watched from the window as the officer knocked on his door. Steve came out, with that calm smile as always, like he had no clue what was going on. The conversation was brief. I saw the officer show him the photo, and Steve, of course, denied everything. In the end, they shook hands and the officer left. When the officer came back to me, he looked almost a little unsettled. "Mr. Steve claims he has nothing to do with this. He says he doesn't know how the photo was taken and that someone may be trying to frame him. He suggested that maybe you're overreacting." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Overreacting? Steve was making me look like a fool right in front of the police, and they were falling for it. "Listen," I said, almost pleading. "This guy is threatening me, threatening my family. We can't just ignore this." The officer sighed, trying to be understanding. "Look, I understand this must be causing a lot of stress, but without definitive proof, there's not much we can do. We'll have a patrol car pass by the area for a while, just as a precaution. If you notice anything strange again, don't hesitate to call us." I knew that wouldn't do anything. Steve was smart. He knew exactly how far he could go without getting caught. The presence of a patrol car would only make him more careful, more meticulous. And worst of all, now he knew I was desperate. That only made the game more fun for him. That night, after the police left, my wife locked herself in the bedroom with the kids, and I kept watch in the living room. Every noise outside felt like it was Steve. Every shadow seemed like his silhouette lurking. I knew he was out there, laughing at me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And then, in the middle of the night, the phone rang. I answered, my voice still groggy with sleep, but the response on the other end woke me up in an instant. It was just breathing, heavy, slow breathing, like someone was on the other end of the line, just waiting. "Hello? Who's there?" I asked, but no one responded. Just the breathing, and after a few seconds, the call ended. Terror was seeping into our home in every possible way. Steve didn't need to spy through the window or leave notes anymore. Now he was inside our heads, breaking us down little by little, and I didn't know how much longer we could hold on. I didn't think things could get any worse, but they were about to reach a new level of nightmare. The atmosphere at home was unbearable. Everyone was tiptoeing around, as if any sudden movement would attract Steve to us. I was at my breaking point, my wife was terrified, and the kids, well, they could sense something was wrong, but we tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, which only seemed to make things worse. It was a Sunday afternoon when everything finally collapsed. The kids were playing in the backyard, as usual. I was in the kitchen, watching through the window, trying to relax a little. My wife was upstairs, tidying things up. Everything seemed normal, at least for a few minutes. Then, when I looked back at the yard, my heart stopped. My oldest son, Lucas, had disappeared. I blinked, trying to comprehend what had happened. 1 second he was there, laughing and running with his sister, and the next, nothing. There was no sign of him. I called his name, but there was no answer. I rushed outside, panic flooding my mind, scanning the yard. My daughter was standing there, staring at me with those big, frightened eyes. "Where's Lucas?" I asked, trying to stay calm. She just shook her head, not knowing. Desperation took over. I started running through the neighborhood, shouting his name, searching every corner. That fear, that overwhelming sense that something terrible had happened, consumed me completely. I went to Steve's house, pounded on the door so hard that my fists hurt. He didn't answer. No one responded. But I knew he had something to do with this. My wife appeared at our front door, already panicking, holding our daughter in her arms. "What's going on? Where's Lucas?" she asked, her voice trembling. I could only shake my head. I had no answer for her. I didn't know where he was, and it was tearing me apart. I called the police immediately. They arrived quickly, and soon our house was surrounded by officers and curious neighbors, all trying to help in some way. I could barely think straight. All I could picture was my son in Steve's hands, or worse, somewhere I'd never find him. Those were the longest hours of my life. And then, out of nowhere, he appeared. Lucas was back in the yard, as if nothing had happened. He just showed up, alone, walking slowly, with a strange expression on his face. When I saw him, I ran to him and hugged him with all the strength I had. "My God, Lucas, where were you?" I asked, looking at him, trying to understand what had happened. But he just looked at me with those empty eyes and said, "I don't remember, Dad. I only remember being in the yard. And then, nothing." I was relieved he was back, but at the same time, that emptiness in his gaze left a knot in my stomach. How could he not remember anything? What had Steve done to him? Or was it all in my head? Was the pressure making me imagine things that weren't real? The police asked Lucas a few questions, but he kept saying the same thing. He didn't remember where he had gone or what had happened. There were no signs of violence, nothing to indicate he had been taken by force. But I knew, deep down, that Steve was behind this. Yet, once again, I had no proof. That night, while the kids slept, my wife and I sat in the living room in silence. She stared off into space, clutching our son's pillow. "This can't go on," she finally said, her voice breaking. "We need to leave. This place is destroying us." She was right, and I knew it. But running, fleeing, was that what Steve wanted? To make me give up everything? I couldn't let him win like that. But at the same time, I couldn't risk my family's safety. I was trapped, not knowing what to do. And the worst part was that I had the feeling that, no matter how hard I tried, Steve was always one step ahead. The only thing I knew was that he wasn't done yet. And whatever he was planning next, I wasn't prepared for it. That night, after Lucas came back, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, the lights off, listening to the sounds of the house. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside made me jump. I was exhausted, but at the same time, I couldn't relax. I knew Steve was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. My wife and the kids were asleep upstairs, and for a moment, the silence in the house felt reassuring. But then, something changed. It was as if the air grew heavier. Suddenly, I heard a noise. Footsteps, coming from the hallway upstairs. I stood up quickly, my heart racing, trying not to make any noise. I crept up the stairs, feeling the floor creak under my feet. When I reached the top, I noticed that the door to the kids' room was slightly ajar. I took a deep breath and slowly pushed it open. The room was dark, but with the moonlight coming through the window, I could see enough. The kids were in bed, sleeping peacefully. But something was wrong. Someone else was in the room. I felt the presence before I even saw it. In the corner, near the window, there was a figure standing. A tall shadow, motionless, watching the children sleep. My body froze. For a second, I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at that figure in the dim light. And then he slowly turned around. It was Steve. His face was partially illuminated by the moonlight, but what scared me was the smile. That same forced, empty smile I had seen so many times before. But now it seemed more real, more threatening. "You shouldn't have called the police," he said softly, his voice calm, as if we were having a casual conversation. That only made things worse. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What was he doing here? How had he gotten into my house? And the worst, what did he want with my kids? I knew I had to act quickly. I took a step forward, but before I could do anything, Steve raised one of his hands, as if stopping me with a simple gesture. "I just wanted to talk," he said, in that calm voice. "You don't need to do anything. Just listen." My blood was boiling, but at the same time I was completely paralyzed. He was too close to the kids, and any wrong move could put everything at risk. "Why are you doing this, Steve?" My voice came out shaky, filled with rage and fear. "What do you want?" He took a step forward, emerging from the shadows. Now I could see his face clearly. That smile was gone. In its place was a cold, almost indifferent expression. "You never understood, did you? This was never about you. It's not about what I want. It's about what they want." "They? What are you talking about?" Steve tilted his head, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he looked at the kids, still peacefully sleeping. "They've always been here, watching. You just didn't see them." I didn't know if he was crazy, if he was playing games with me, or if there was something darker behind all of this. But the way he spoke, the certainty in his voice, it terrified me. Suddenly, Steve took another step toward the kids, and that was enough to snap me out of the trance. I rushed at him, but before I could reach him, he turned quickly, like a shadow, and slipped out through the open window, disappearing into the night. I stood there, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I ran to the window and looked outside, but Steve was already gone. It was as if he had never been there. At that moment, I knew we couldn't stay any longer. Steve had crossed a line, invading our home, touching our lives in a way I could never forget. He wasn't going to stop, not until he got whatever it was he wanted. I went back to the kids' room and watched them for a while. They were sleeping soundly, unaware of the terror surrounding us. My wife appeared behind me, frightened, asking what had happened. All I could do was shake my head. I didn't have any words left. I knew our only option now was to run, to get out of that house as quickly as possible. The next day, we started packing. I didn't know where we would go, but I knew we couldn't stay there. Steve was slowly destroying us, and if we remained in that place, he would eventually win. But even as we packed, a part of me knew that running wouldn't solve anything. Steve, or whatever was behind him, would always find a way to reach us. And so, deep down, the question that kept echoing in my mind was, would we ever truly be safe? As we loaded the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were simply delaying the inevitable. The house, the neighborhood, the familiar streets, they all seemed to blur into one as we drove away. I glanced at my wife, her face etched with worry, and then at the kids, who were unusually quiet in the back seat. They didn't ask where we were going, and I didn't have the heart to explain that I didn't know either. The fear that had gripped me in that house was still with me, gnawing at my every thought. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Steve's figure lurking behind us. But the road remained empty, the world outside strangely calm. We drove for hours, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that place. But no matter how far we went, the weight of Steve's presence lingered, like a shadow we couldn't escape. Finally, we arrived at a motel on the outskirts of a small town. It was old, run down, the kind of place people stayed when they had nowhere else to go. But at that moment, it felt like a refuge. We checked in, and once inside the room, we tried to settle down. But the tension was palpable. My wife kept looking at me, as if waiting for reassurance I couldn't give. The kids were restless, sensing the unease that had taken hold of us all. That night, as we lay in the unfamiliar beds, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building, every distant sound, made me jump. My mind raced with thoughts of Steve, of his cryptic words, of the darkness that seemed to follow him wherever he went. And then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound, half dreading what I might see. The curtains were drawn, but the silhouette behind them was unmistakable. A figure, tall and still, standing just outside. My heart sank. I didn't need to see his face to know who it was. Steve had found us. I sat up, trembling, and glanced at my wife, who was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the nightmare just outside. I knew I had to do something, but my body felt like it was made of lead, too heavy to move. The tapping continued, steady, relentless. Finally, I forced myself to my feet and walked over to the window. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pulled the curtain aside. But when I looked out, the space was empty. The parking lot beyond was deserted, bathed in the dim light of a flickering street lamp. There was no sign of Steve, no sign of anyone. I stood there for a long time, staring out into the night, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I let the curtain fall back into place and returned to bed. My heart was still racing, and sleep remained out of reach. I lay there, eyes wide open, listening to the silence, wondering how much longer we could keep running. Because deep down, I knew the truth. Steve, or whatever force was behind him, wouldn't stop. Not until he had what he wanted. And no matter where we went, no matter how far we fled, we would never truly be safe. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun.